I never thought a simple move to a new apartment would lead to the nightmares I would live through. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a new place, a new chapter in life. But from the moment I stepped foot inside the old building, I felt something was wrong. There was an odd heaviness in the air, like the place was holding on to memories it wasn't willing to let go of. I had just gotten a job in the city, and the apartment was small but affordable. Located on the top floor of a tall, aging building, it was perfect for a single person like me. The landlord, an old woman with a strange look in her eyes, seemed nice enough. She handed me the keys and warned me, "The building is old, but don't worry. You'll get used to it." The first night wasn't so bad. I unpacked a few things, set up my bed, and tried to get some rest after the long drive. The apartment had the usual creaks and groans of an older building, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. It was just the sound of the house settling, I told myself. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A soft tapping noise. It was slow at first, just a faint knock against the wall. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just the wind or the building's age. But as the night went on, the sound grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the other side of the wall, from the apartment next door. I knew I was alone in the building, so it couldn't be anyone else. The sound continued, and I felt my heart race with every tap. The noise was getting closer, as if something or someone was moving through the walls. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, just like that. It was as if whatever had been there was waiting for me to notice it. I lay in silence, my mind racing with questions and fears. The next morning, I tried to shake off the weird feeling. Maybe it was just my imagination, but as the days went on, I started to notice more strange things, small things at first. A light flickering in the hallway, the sound of footsteps in the empty stairway, a shadow darting out of the corner of my eye. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to my apartment to find the door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I immediately felt that same sense of unease in the air. The apartment felt different. The temperature was colder, and the light seemed dimmer. But what caught my attention was the mirror in the hallway. It was covered in condensation, despite the fact that the air was dry. I wiped it with my sleeve, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the reflection, something behind me. I spun around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just tired. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. One night, I decided to stay late at work, hoping to escape the eerie feeling that had settled over the apartment. When I returned, it was almost midnight. The building was silent, and the hallway was bathed in an unsettling stillness. As I approached my door, I felt something watching me. I turned to see a figure at the end of the hallway standing in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, too tall to be human, and it was wearing what looked like an old, tattered coat. It was standing perfectly still, not moving an inch. I couldn't see its face, it was obscured by the shadows. The only thing I could make out were its long, bony hands hanging by its sides. I took a step back, my breath quickening, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I rushed into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. Something was wrong with the building, with this apartment. But I had no choice. It was all I could afford. That night, the tapping came again. Only this time it wasn't just on the wall. It was in the floor, in the ceiling, in the air around me. Tap, tap, tap. It was all I could hear, growing louder and more frantic. I got out of bed, my legs weak with fear. The apartment was cold now, colder than I had ever felt it before. I looked at the wall where the tapping seemed to be coming from, and that's when I saw it. A crack, a thin, jagged line running along the wall, stretching from the floor to the ceiling. The crack seemed to move, slowly, as if something inside the wall was pushing against it. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint but clear, "Help." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was not my own, and it wasn't coming from anywhere in the room. It was coming from the wall itself. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the crack. The wall was warm, unnaturally so, and then, without warning, the crack widened. I pulled my hand back quickly, but it was too late. From the wall, something began to emerge. It was dark, its shape indistinct, but I could feel its presence, its malice. The thing in the wall, it was alive. The thing in the wall began to shift and twitch, its form stretching and twisting, as if it was trying to break free from its prison. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, my eyes wide with terror. I could hear the walls creaking, the entire building groaning, as if it too was being pulled into the strange force that was emerging. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I scream? My body was frozen, as though the fear had taken root deep inside me, keeping me paralyzed. The air grew thick, heavy, and the temperature dropped even further. My skin tingled with cold as I stared at the dark shape creeping out of the crack. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too long and too thin. Its body seemed to be made of shadows, tendrils of darkness that shifted like smoke. I could barely make out its features, but there was something about its face, if you could call it that made my blood run cold. Its eyes were hollow, black voids, and its mouth was a jagged, gaping hole that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew that it was not a creature meant to be in this world. Its very presence was wrong. Without thinking, I turned and bolted out of the apartment. I slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran down the hall, my footsteps echoing against the empty walls, but the fear gnawing at me wouldn't let up. I could feel it watching me, following me. I reached the stairwell and rushed down the steps, the cold feeling on my back growing stronger. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see it right behind me, but the stairwell was empty. The silence felt even more oppressive now, as though the whole building had fallen into some sort of unnatural stillness. But just as I reached the ground floor, I heard it again, the tapping. It wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from above, tap, tap, tap. The sound was slow, deliberate, and filled with an unsettling rhythm. My head snapped upward, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone, standing at the top of the stairs. A figure, just like the one I had seen before, but this time, it was clearer. Its face, or the absence of one, was there, staring down at me from the darkness above. Its long arms reached out, its bony fingers tapping against the banister. I froze. I knew I should run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like the walls of the building were closing in on me, trapping me in its grip. The figure started to descend the stairs toward me, slow and methodical. With each step, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, twisting around its form. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to back away, but I could barely move. The fear was too much. I was paralyzed. Then it spoke. "Leave, before it's too late." The voice was a whisper, but it echoed in my mind, filling me with dread. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words left me frozen in place. I was stuck, unable to move, unable to escape. The figure didn't stop. It continued its slow descent, its hollow eyes fixed on me, its mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. I could feel its cold presence reaching out, wrapping around me like an invisible force. I knew I had to leave, but the terror that gripped me made it impossible to act. Suddenly, there was a loud crash behind me, a sound so sharp that it snapped me out of my stupor. I whipped around to see the door to the street had been thrown open, and standing there was an older man, his face pale and weathered. He looked at me, his eyes wide with concern. "Run," he shouted. "Get out, now." I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and sprinted toward the door, my legs finally working again, though my body felt heavy, as though something was trying to pull me back into the darkness. The figure was still coming down the stairs, but I didn't dare look back. I burst through the door and out into the cold night air, my heart still racing. I didn't stop running until I reached the street corner. my breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around me felt wrong, as if the shadows themselves were watching, waiting. I glanced up at the building, but it was like the apartment had vanished. All I could see was the faint outline of the dark, crumbling structure, its windows dark and empty. I didn't know who the man was, or how he knew what was happening, but I wasn't about to question him. I turned down the street and kept running, away from that apartment, away from whatever was lurking inside. But even as I ran, I could feel it, the cold presence, the weight of those hollow eyes on me. It wasn't over. Whatever was in that apartment wasn't done with me yet. I knew I had to leave the city. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with whatever was lurking in the shadows of that building. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing in the walls was still following me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hadn't escaped it, not really. And as I looked back one last time at the dark outline of the building, I knew it was only a matter of time before it found me again. I spent the next few days in a state of constant paranoia, my mind never fully able to relax. I checked over my shoulder wherever I went, half expecting the shadows to reach out and grab me. Even in the safety of daylight, the images of that thing in the wall and the figure on the stairs haunted me. It felt like the very air around me was thick with dread, and no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still there, waiting for me. I didn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't. I called the landlord, but she didn't answer. Every time I tried, it went straight to voicemail. I sent an email asking about my security deposit, but I got no response. She had vanished, like everything else about the building. The only thing that remained was the creeping terror. I stayed with a friend for a few days, trying to gather my thoughts. But each night, I dreamed of the apartment, of the long, shadowy figure that had stared down at me from the stairwell, and of the cold voice that had whispered in my ear. I saw that cracked wall again and again, the dark, shifting shape pushing its way through the opening. I could hear the tapping, the soft rhythm of it, like a countdown. It was as though the place had marked me, claimed me in some twisted way, and no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape it. I decided to go back. I had to. Something inside me urged me to return, to figure out what was happening. I didn't know if it was my curiosity or something darker, something that had been planted in my mind by whatever was in that apartment, but I knew I couldn't just walk away from it. So I gathered my things, threw them into a suitcase, and took a cab back to the building. It looked the same, but somehow different. The air was heavier now, as though the very ground beneath my feet was trembling with the presence of something ancient and evil. The streetlights flickered as I approached, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to follow me. I stood in front of the building for a moment, trying to gather the courage to go inside. I could hear the faint tapping once more, far off, like a distant memory that was pulling me in. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, but I couldn't stop myself. I entered the building, and immediately, I felt it, the change in the air. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on me before was even worse now. The halls were silent, too silent. The old wood creaked beneath my feet as I walked toward the stairwell. The building felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. I knew it was foolish to go up there, but the compulsion was overwhelming. My heart beat erratically in my chest as I ascended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the top floor, the door to my apartment was still there. The light from the hallway flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that danced around the doorframe. I stood in front of it for a moment, my hand hovering over the knob. I didn't want to go in. Part of me screamed for me to leave, but the other part, some darker part of me, felt like I had no choice. I opened the door. Inside, everything was as it had been. The furniture was still in place, the dishes still piled up in the sink, and the bed was unmade as though I had just left the night before. But something was different. The air was colder. The walls, they seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a constant low hum that made my skin crawl. And there, in the corner of the room, the crack in the wall was larger now. It was no longer just a small line stretching up the wall. It had split wide open, as if the apartment was slowly giving way to something beneath the surface. The dark, shifting form was there again, just behind the crack, barely visible, but unmistakably present. I could feel it watching me. Without thinking, I moved toward it. I don't know why I did it. I just knew that I had to see it, to understand what was happening. The crack seemed to draw me in, pulling me closer to it. As I stepped forward, the temperature dropped sharply, and the walls began to tremble. And then, the thing emerged. It was worse than before. It was no longer just a shadow, it was a creature. A mass of darkness and grotesque shapes, limbs stretching and twisting, the air around it bending with unnatural force. It was moving toward me, slow and deliberate, its eyes, or what passed for eyes, glowing a sickly yellow. "Help!" the voice whispered again, but this time it was louder, closer. The words came from everywhere, echoing around me, filling. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could feel something cold wrap around my body, trapping me in place. The creature reached out, its long fingers brushing against my skin, sending a chill through my veins. "Leave, or stay," it whispered. "But it's too late for you." I screamed, a sound that echoed through the room and beyond, but no one was there to hear it. The shadows were everywhere now, surrounding me, crawling toward me, suffocating me. And then, the room went dark. When the darkness consumed everything, I thought I had lost all sense of time. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadows wrapped themselves tighter around me, pulling me deeper into the abyss. My eyes couldn't adjust. My body felt numb, and I could no longer tell if I was alive or if I had crossed over into something far worse. And then, a faint light flickered. It was small at first, just a tiny glimmer that broke through the overwhelming darkness. I tried to reach for it, desperate for any sign of hope. The shadows were still trying to drag me back, but the light was pulling me toward it. The creature's whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if it realized I was slipping away from its grasp. "Stay. Stay with us," it hissed, its voice now distorted, as if it came from the walls themselves. "You belong here." But I didn't belong there. Not anymore. I couldn't. I pushed forward, my feet feeling like they were stuck in thick, cloying mud, but the light grew stronger with each step. Finally, with one last burst of energy, I reached it. The moment I touched the light, it engulfed me completely, and I felt warmth rush through my body. Something I hadn't felt since the moment I stepped into the building. The shadows screamed in fury, but I was free. I blinked, and the darkness faded. I found myself standing outside, back on the street. The air was cold, but the weight of the building, the suffocating presence of the thing inside it, was gone. I looked up at the apartment, now just a regular old building in the fading light of day. It looked completely normal, nothing out of place, but I knew better. I could feel it deep in my bones. Whatever had been there, whatever had taken hold of that place, was gone for now. But the feeling lingered, a dark reminder of everything I had witnessed. I never went back. The apartment was sold, and the landlord's name was no longer on the lease. The people who lived there after me never reported anything strange, but I knew the truth. The building had been hiding something ancient, something that lived in the walls, waiting for the right moment to claim anyone who came too close. I left the city for good, took another job, and moved as far away as I could. But no matter where I went, I could never escape the feeling that the shadows were still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes, I'll hear the tapping again. It's faint, far off, but I know what it means. And I wonder, if I hadn't escaped, if I hadn't found the light, would I have become just another shadow in the walls? Would I have stayed there forever, part of the building, part of the darkness? I don't want to know. I never want to go back. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, and one day, it will find me again. Moving to the city was supposed to be a fresh start for me. I had just landed my first real job out of college, and after months of staying in temporary places, I finally found an apartment I could afford. It wasn't much, a small one-bedroom on the 4th floor of an old building. but it was cheap and the location was great. The building was a little rundown, but it was close to my office and I figured I'd deal with the quirks. The landlord was an older man, Mr. Darnell. He had a warm smile, though there was something unsettling about his eyes, kind of distant, like he was looking past me rather than at me. He didn't say much about the building's history, just that it had been around for decades and that it was safe and quiet. He was eager to get me moved in, and after a quick tour of the apartment, I signed the lease without a second thought. The first few days were uneventful. The apartment was small, but comfortable enough for me to settle into. There was an old-fashioned radiator that clicked and clanked, but it kept the place warm. The building itself was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't until I moved in that I realized there was no elevator. The stairs creaked with every step, but that didn't bother me too much. I was in my 20s, I could handle it. But after a few days, I began to notice something strange. It started with the sound of footsteps. At night, I'd hear someone walking above me. I lived on the 4th floor, and it sounded like someone was pacing back and forth on the 5th floor, the steps slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it was just the creaking of the building settling, but the sound persisted night after night. It was as if someone was walking in heavy boots, dragging their feet across the floor. I mentioned it to Mr. Darnell the next time I saw him in the hallway. He gave me one of those polite smiles and waved it off. "Old buildings make noise, my dear. Don't let it bother you," he said, his voice so calm it almost felt rehearsed. But it did bother me. The pacing continued, always at night, like a rhythmic tapping that echoed through the walls. It started to feel like someone was trying to get my attention, but when I looked out my window or checked the hallway, no one was ever there. One evening, after another restless night of pacing above, I decided to investigate. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the stairs, slowly climbing to the 5th floor. The door at the top of the stairs was slightly ajar, and a cold draft came from the crack. My heart raced. I stood there for a moment debating whether to knock or just turn back. But the sound of footsteps echoed from within, louder now, like someone was walking right behind the door. I pushed it open. The hallway was dimly lit, the light flickering like it was on its last legs. The air was musty, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in a long time. The apartments on the 5th floor appeared to be abandoned, the doors closed and locked tight. I could see nothing out of the ordinary, but the sound of footsteps grew louder. I crept further down the hallway, my flashlight beam scanning every corner. That's when I saw it. A door at the very end of the hall, half open, with a sliver of light spilling out from the gap. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it. I walked toward the door, the footsteps now stopping as if they had been waiting for me to come closer. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. It was cold to the touch, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But something pushed me forward, and I stepped inside. The room was empty, completely empty, except for a single chair in the middle of the floor. The walls were bare, and the windows were boarded up with thick wooden planks. It was eerily quiet, save for the sound of my breathing. I scanned the room, feeling a strange chill creeping over me. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the room, barely visible in the darkness, was a door. It wasn't there a moment ago, but now it was. A door that led into another room. I didn't want to go any further. Everything inside me screamed to turn around, to leave, but my feet moved forward as if they had a mind of their own. As I approached the door, I felt a cold, oppressive weight settle in my chest. It was as if something was waiting on the other side, something old. My hand was frozen in place just above the doorknob. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Suddenly, the door creaked open. And then, I heard the whisper, "Come in." The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakably there. My body went rigid. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on that door, and I had to know what was behind it. I reached for the knob and turned it. The door swung wide open, revealing a dark room, so dark that the flashlight's beam didn't even penetrate it. I could feel the temperature drop as I stepped inside, my breath visible in the cold air. I fumbled to turn on the light switch, but it wouldn't work. The room was bathed in an unnatural darkness, thick and suffocating. Then I saw them. Figures. Pale, shadowy figures standing against the walls. They didn't move, didn't blink. They were just there. A dozen of them, maybe more, all staring at me with hollow eyes, their faces expressionless, their bodies thin and frail. I stumbled backward, but my foot caught on something, and I fell hard to the floor. The figures didn't react. They just stood there, watching. And then I realized they were not just shadows. They were people. People who had been trapped here, stuck in this room, their souls trapped in the darkness. One of them, a woman with hollow cheeks and long, unkempt hair, took a step toward me. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. The only thing I could hear was the faint whisper in the air, the same voice that had called me inside. "Help us." I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my chest. My heart pounded as I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see them anymore. I rushed down the hall, past the half-open door and back to the stairs. I nearly tripped as I descended, not stopping until I reached the safety of my own apartment. The pacing above me had stopped. The building was silent again. But I knew something had changed. I had uncovered something that I wasn't meant to see. The forgotten floor, the one no one spoke about. The next day, I packed my things. I didn't care about the lease anymore. I wasn't staying another night in that building. I left the key on the counter, and I walked away. But even now, every time I hear footsteps above me or feel a chill in the air, I remember the door I opened, the figures in the dark, and the whisper that still lingers in my mind, "Help us." I never looked back at the building again after I left that day. I packed up my things, signed a new lease for a different apartment in a safer part of town, and tried to move on with my life. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown. It was something deeper, something that had settled into my soul the moment I stepped into that dark room. The months passed, and I managed to convince myself that it was all in my head. The figures I saw, the whispers, the cold. Maybe it was just the mind playing tricks, some sort of post-traumatic stress from the isolation of city life. But then, late one night, just as I was about to fall asleep in my new apartment, I heard it, the tapping. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. But it grew louder, step after step, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor. The same sound I had heard in the building before. I froze. My heart began to race as my eyes darted around the room. The sound wasn't coming from the neighbors, it was coming from my own walls. The walls that surrounded me, that held me in this place. The same rhythm, the same eerie cadence. I sat up in bed, my mind racing with all the things I had experienced. I didn't want to face it, but deep down I knew. I couldn't escape it. No matter how far I ran, it would find me. The tapping stopped. But then I heard the whisper, "Help us." It was the same voice, faint, almost too soft to catch, but unmistakable. It came from within the walls, from somewhere behind them, like it was reaching through, trying to grab me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I wasn't alone. I hadn't escaped. The things I had seen on that forgotten floor, the souls trapped in that darkness, they had followed me. I grabbed my phone, shaking as I dialed the landlord's number for the building I had left behind. My hand trembled so much that I nearly dropped the phone. The line clicked, and a voice answered. "Hello, this is Mr. Darnell. How can I help you?" I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't expected him to answer. I had assumed he'd be long gone, no longer managing the building. I swallowed hard before speaking. "Mr. Darnell, about the 5th floor. What's going on in that building? What's in the room on the 5th floor? Who are the people? What happened to them?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he replied, "You shouldn't have gone there. You never should have opened that door." I gripped the phone harder. What happened to them? The people in the room? He sighed deeply, the sound of his breath echoing in my ear. They were all forgotten, left behind, trapped by something ancient in that building, something that doesn't let go. It pulls them in, keeps them there, feeding off their fear, their despair. Those souls, they can't escape. A cold sweat dripped down my back as I listened, my body trembling. Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you tell me any of this? Because, my dear, he said softly, the building needs new souls to keep going. It's been here longer than anyone realizes. And when you opened that door, you became one of its victims. They follow those who see the truth. They can't leave you, not until you're one of them. I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted to hang up, to pretend I hadn't heard a word. But deep inside, I knew he was telling the truth. The tapping you hear, Mr. Darnell continued, is the footsteps of those trapped, the ones who cannot move on. They'll find you, and you will never be free of them. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The whispering voice grew louder, and the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't just in my walls, it was in my room. It was coming from behind the door. I stood frozen in place as the room darkened, the temperature dropping. My breath became visible in the air, and I could see the shadows moving across the wall. I could feel them, feel the figures that had followed me from that cursed building. They were here. I turned toward the door, but I couldn't move. The shadows began to reach for me, their long fingers creeping out from the darkness, their hollow eyes staring at me, unblinking. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if it was closing in on me. And then, just as I thought I would be consumed by the darkness, I heard a new sound, a loud, booming knock on the door. My heart raced, and I ran to open it, desperate to see who was on the other side, desperate for a glimpse of daylight, of sanity. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. Only darkness. The shadows poured out of the room, swirling around me, and I knew deep down that there would be no escape. I was trapped, just like those on the forgotten floor. They had pulled me in, just as they had warned, and now I would join them. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the whispers once more. Help us. But there was no help. Not anymore. And as I looked into the dark, cold eyes of the figures surrounding me, I understood. I wasn't just a victim. I was a part of the building now, part of its story, part of its endless hunger, and no matter where I went, I would never be free.